"Don't look at me," she whispered, bruised and barefoot, but the rancher fell to one knee and said, "Western Frontier, 1883. The lantern light in Dust Haven flickered against cracked wooden walls as whispers traveled faster than the evening wind. A barefoot girl, torn dress, bruised cheek, had stumbled into town at dusk, clutching nothing but her silence. Folks at the saloon froze mid-sip, their poker cards forgotten. "She ran from him, I swear it," a ranch hand muttered near the bar. "No woman comes crawling through the dirt like that unless hell's at her back." Outside, the storm gathered, heavy clouds pressing low over the dry earth. Sheriff's boots clicked against the boardwalk, but even he didn't dare meet her eyes. She wouldn't let him. She pressed her face down, whispering, trembling, "Don't look at me." And yet across the square, one man rose from his seat by the blacksmith's forge. A rancher, known for his calloused hands, broad shoulders, and a quiet grief he never spoke of. He walked toward her as though the storm itself had called him. When he knelt in the dirt before her, townsfolk held their breath. No one expected the hardened rancher to bow, not to anyone, least of all to a broken girl, but his voice was steady, soft enough to shake the silence. "You don't have to run anymore." The rain fell in sheets, hammering against the wooden planks of Dust Haven like 100 tiny hammers striking in unison. The sky hung heavy and low. Clouds pressed down on the town as if trying to squash it into the dust. Clara stumbled onto the boardwalk, bare feet sinking into the wet, gritty wood. Her dress was torn, soaked through, clinging to bruised skin, and her hair plastered across her face. The lanterns that lined the town flickered and swayed in the wind, casting distorted shadows that danced across the weathered walls of the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, and the empty church steps. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhale tasting of mud and iron. She pulled her knees up, hugging herself against the chill, and whispered through cracked lips, "Don't look at me." The words were swallowed by the roar of the storm. Inside the saloon, men and women froze mid-sip. The sound of glasses clinking halted as if the storm had sucked all noise into itself. Murmurs ran like wildfire along the polished bar. "Who is she?" one man whispered, leaning against the rough wood. "Ran from him," another replied, voice low, almost afraid. "No woman comes crawling through the dirt like that unless hell's at her back." Clara's heart pounded. Every shadow seemed to hold someone waiting to drag her back. She pressed her face down further, wishing she could disappear entirely into the night, wishing the storm would swallow her whole. A horse whinnied in the distance, hooves striking the wet earth with a hollow, echoing sound. The boards creaked under her weight, water pooling between the cracks, soaking into her soles, sending sharp shocks up her legs. She tried to keep moving, shoving forward, but her energy wavered. Then she saw him. Elias, the rancher, stood at the edge of the blacksmith's forge, shoulders squared against the wind. His coat flapped around him like the wings of a dark bird. His eyes, shadowed under a broad-brimmed hat, were fixed on her. Every other movement, every whisper in town seemed to blur and fade as he took a step toward her. She wanted to recoil, to vanish into the mud and rain, but there was something in his gaze, steady, unyielding, and unafraid, that made her pause. "Please, don't," she murmured, barely audible over the pounding rain, twisting her head downward. He ignored the plea, each step deliberate, boots sloshing through puddles, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, voice low but carrying through the storm. His words seemed to push the wind aside, if only for a moment, if only for her ears alone. She blinked against the rain, confusion and fear twisting her gut. The town had gone silent, watching as he closed the distance, not with weapons drawn, not with accusations, but simply moving toward her. A loose board snapped under her foot, splashing water over her ankle, and she stumbled. Instinctively he caught her arm, strong yet gentle, and guided her upright. Her body pressed briefly against his side as he steadied her, and for the first time her chest loosened enough to take a shaky breath. I said, "Don't look at me," she whispered again, voice quivering with old terror and shame. His hands remained steady on hers. "I am looking," he replied, voice like warm earth after rain. "I'm not letting you disappear." Clara's knees trembled, soaked through and raw from the boards, and she sank briefly onto a low step, water running down her arms. Elias crouched beside her, keeping his coat from pressing too hard against her soaked body, and offered a small, folded blanket from inside his coat. She hesitated but took it, the rough fabric scratching her skin, yet its warmth reaching deep, stirring something long buried. Outside, lightning cut across the sky, illuminating the square in stark silver, shadows twisting over broken fences, puddles, and old wagon wheels. The wind howled, tugging at her dress, whipping her hair into her eyes. But the warmth from the blanket, from his presence, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. Somewhere beyond the town, the horses stamped and shook their manes, restless. Clara lifted her eyes, finally meeting his gaze. Not fully, but enough. The storm raged around them, yet inside that small square a fragile calm settled. A gust tore past them, flinging rain into her hair, and she shivered, half from cold, half from disbelief that someone could stand here, steady, while she was unraveling. His hand brushed hers as he adjusted the blanket, a fleeting, silent gesture, yet one loaded with intent. "We'll get through this," he murmured, tone almost tender, almost hesitant. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear again. Yet a strange, dangerous longing rooted her in place. The lanterns flickered once more, casting an amber glow across their faces, mingling with the silver of the storm. The townsfolk peered from windows, whispers curling into the night like smoke, but Elias's presence formed a wall against them. Clara's soaked hair clung to her cheeks. She tasted salt from tears she hadn't known she shed. The wind shrieked around the corners of buildings, but inside the circle of lantern light, a fragile understanding began to form. Fear met with courage, pain met with quiet strength. The storm roared on, yet for the first time in months, Clara felt herself rooted, not fleeing, a heartbeat of hope forming in the mud and rain. And though she could not yet fully lift her chin, though she could not yet meet the world with open eyes, she allowed herself a single thought. Perhaps someone could see her without breaking her. The ranch lay silent under the gray drizzle, the wooden beams of the house creaking as if mourning with the wind. Elias led Clara inside, closing the heavy door behind them with a dull thud that echoed through the empty rooms. Dust motes danced in the weak lantern light, settling on untouched quilts and a cradle that had not known a child in years. Clara's bare feet sank into the worn floorboards, and she hugged herself, shivering from both cold and the oppressive weight of absence. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and lingering sorrow, a mixture that made her stomach tighten. She hesitated at the threshold, feeling every bruise, every tear in her dress, every unspoken confession pressing against her chest. I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, voice trembling as she sank onto the edge of a dusty chair. Elias set the lantern on the table, its flickering flame casting shadows over the room. He said nothing at first, merely moved to unfasten the torn seam of her dress. His hands were careful, patient, and she flinched slightly before realizing he was steady, not judgmental. The sound of needle-piercing fabric was faint but grounding, mingling with the occasional sigh of the wind through broken shutters. Clara's eyes drifted over the house, a high-backed rocking chair that had stopped in mid-sway, a stack of untouched journals, a faded photograph of a smiling woman, arms wrapped around a small boy. The ghosts of the past filled the spaces, and she felt both welcome and intruder. Finally, she moved toward the hearth and knelt to tend the small fire, her hands brushing ash and ember. The warmth seeped slowly through her chilled fingers, and the smell of smoke and burning pine seemed to fill the cracks in her courage. She dug into a basket of flour and water, her fingers clumsy at first as she shaped bread for the first time in years. The dough squished and folded, warm and alive beneath her touch, and she felt an odd comfort in the rhythm of kneading. Elias watched from across the room, silent, his jaw tight, eyes flicking from her hands to the firelight. Neither spoke of the tragedies that had brought them here. Both understood the weight of absence. A chair scraped softly as he moved closer, lifting a blanket from a shelf and draping it across her shoulders. She caught his wrist briefly, a silent acknowledgement that she had not entirely lost the ability to trust. The fire cracked, sparks flying upward, and Clara allowed herself a small, cautious smile. Each gesture, the repair of torn fabric, the turning of dough, the offering of warmth, was a thread weaving fragile trust between them. Outside, the rain drummed against the roof in steady rhythm, and the wind rattled the shutters like distant voices pressing against the walls. Clara flinched at each gust, but felt Elias's presence beside her, a quiet anchor against the storm. When the bread was set to rise near the fire, she brushed flour from her hands and looked toward him. Their eyes met briefly, unspoken stories reflected in each glance. She saw his grief, the empty chair at the head of the table, the dust on the crib, the old journals untouched for years, and it mirrored her own. Yet the shared silence was not oppressive. It was a space where two broken people could begin to rebuild. She touched the side of the hearth, feeling the warmth radiate, and allowed a tiny thread of hope to weave through her chest. Elias adjusted the lantern again, his shadow falling over the floorboards like a protective hand. He poured a cup of water into a chipped tin mug and offered it without a word. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his in the exchange, an almost imperceptible act of intimacy. The wind outside moaned, tugging at the eaves, but inside the house the firelight flickered steady, filling the room with warmth and quiet reassurance. Time moved differently here. The storm outside and the absence within created a strange cocoon. Clara kneaded the dough again, this time with more confidence, feeling each movement stitch her nerves back together. Elias watched with a soft tension in his shoulders, aware that every small gesture mattered. She dared to glance at him more openly now, the edge of fear softened by the rhythmic glow of the fire. The room smelled of flour, smoke, and faint pine, a scent that somehow felt like a beginning. Clara placed the dough on a floured board and pressed her palms against it, feeling the warmth transfer through her hands, feeling that perhaps, in this quiet, broken place, she could start to belong. The rain continued to fall outside, relentless and persistent, but inside, the house held them both in a fragile, flickering light, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them spoke. Yet neither felt alone. The wind cut through Dusthaven like a knife, rattling shutters and stirring dust along the empty streets. Clara crouched by the kitchen window, her fingers gripping the sill as the gusts tugged at her damp hair. The town beyond the fence seemed alive with whispers, voices slipping through cracks in the saloon doors and curling around the corners of the sheriff's office. She had tried to bury herself in the quiet of the ranch, in the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of bread kneading, but the world outside would not let her rest. A drifter at the saloon leaned close to the barkeep, low enough for only the nearest patrons to hear. "She belongs to a cruel man," he murmured, eyes darting to the door. "He'll be looking for her. Mark my words." The words cut sharper than any whip, carving panic into Clara's chest. She stumbled back from the window, heart hammering, and pressed her hands to her face. Images flashed unbidden, dark bonds, the sharp sting of hands she had hoped never to see again. Nights spent shivering on cold floors. Fear surged, wild and consuming, urging her to flee, to disappear into the night before anyone could claim her. Her soaked dress clung to her legs as she ran toward the edge of the porch, toes digging into the cold earth. Elias stepped into her path, boots sinking slightly into the mud, eyes steady and calm. He did not raise a hand, did not shout, did not block her with force. Instead, he simply spoke, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "You're safe here." The words were soft, deliberate, and for a moment the wind seemed to falter, as though pausing to let them resonate. Clara's chest heaved as tears mingled with rain, and she looked at him, searching for deceit and finding none. He offered her a blanket instead of a command, draping it across her trembling shoulders with a gesture of care rather than control. The smell of smoke from the hearth mixed with damp earth, and she pressed herself closer to the warmth, fighting the urge to flee. Elias's eyes flickered toward the empty cradle and dusty quilts scattered throughout the house. For a heartbeat, memories pressed in, his wife's laugh echoing faintly down the hallways. The soft weight of a child curled against him in the dark. And then the fever, the silence, the empty rooms that followed. Clara caught the shift in his expression, a shadow crossing his face, and for the first time, curiosity replaced her fear. She asked, voice barely a whisper, Did you lose someone?" He nodded, gaze distant, tracing the outline of the rocking chair. "A wife, a son," he admitted, voice rough but restrained. "They're gone." Storm took them. Clara lowered her head, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders, and felt a thread of kinship with the man who had carried loss in silence. Her own voice trembled as fragments of her pain spilled out, small shards of memory she had kept locked away. I ran. He hurt me. I didn't want anyone to see me like this." Elias's hand brushed hers, tentative, and she flinched before allowing the brief contact. Outside, the wind whipped across the plains, rustling the fences, rattling the dry grass, carrying the echoes of the past through every creaking board of the ranch. Clara shivered, but this time the shiver was not all fear. She felt a cautious tether forming between them, a fragile understanding that neither was completely alone in their suffering. The rain struck the roof in staccato rhythm, and she listened to it as a lullaby of sorts, a counterpoint to the whispers from the town. Her knees pressed against the floor, and she finally met his gaze fully, allowing herself to see someone who could hold both her and her fear. Elias leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to run anymore. Not from me, not from this place." Clara swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in her throat, tears threatening to spill. But the warmth of the fire and the firmness of his presence anchored her. She exhaled slowly, letting the panic ebb, and for the first time in days she felt her chest unclench slightly. The wind moaned again, teasing through the rafters, bringing with it the sound of horse hooves in the distance and whispers she had thought she would never hear. Yet here, within the walls of this quiet, haunted ranch, the voices of the past were transformed, less as threats, more as memories that could be acknowledged, even endured. Clara pressed her hand against the blanket again, feeling Elias's thumb brush hers ever so slightly, a silent pledge of protection. And though the storm raged outside, inside, in the heart of the house, a fragile calm began to settle, threaded with the tentative promise that she might finally find a place to breathe, a place to begin unwrapping the layers of fear, one small gesture at a time, and perhaps even a place to hope. Lightning split the sky over Dust Haven, jagged and silver, illuminating the plains in harsh, fleeting brilliance. Rain fell in torrents, drumming against the roof and puddling in the low spots of the muddy yard. The wind tore at the fences, rattled the shutters, and sent a chorus of mournful whistles through the trees lining the property. Clara struggled to keep her footing, water soaking through her dress and mud clinging stubbornly to her ankles as she followed Elias across the yard toward the loose gate that threatened to fly open in the storm. Each flash of lightning revealed the dark, roiling clouds above, and the thunder shook the earth beneath them, vibrating through her bones. They moved quickly, tying ropes around the gate, around stray boards that threatened to splinter, their hands wet and trembling from both cold and adrenaline. Elias barked short instructions, but his voice softened each time it brushed against her ear, warm even in the chaos. Clara grabbed a coil of rope and fumbled with the knots, her fingers slick, trembling, until Elias leaned close, adjusting her hands, guiding them with a quiet patience that made her heart hammer. A deafening crack of thunder made her flinch, and in the mud she slipped, nearly toppling into the cold, sucking earth. Elias caught her instantly, one arm under her shoulder, one around her waist, holding her close enough that she felt the heat radiating from his chest, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. She gasped, half in fright, half in a way she could not name, the closeness igniting something fragile and new. Their eyes met in the lightning's brief glare, and she could see a softness in him she had not noticed before, a quiet acceptance that allowed her to breathe amidst the storm. Together they ran to the stables, securing the horses against the wind, whispering assurances to the animals that mingled with reassurances to one another. Clara's hands brushed his as she tied a latch, a fleeting touch that lingered longer than either dared to acknowledge. By the time they returned to the house, drenched, shivering, and exhausted, their clothes plastered to their bodies and mud streaked across their legs. The fire in the hearth had sputtered but still burned, a small, stubborn glow in the darkness. Elias lit a lantern, its warm light spilling across the floorboards, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. They sat on either side, close enough for their knees to touch if they leaned forward, reluctant to retreat from the shared warmth. Clara's fingers brushed his as she reached for the mug of water, a spark of awareness flickering between them that neither spoke aloud. Silence stretched heavy with the residue of adrenaline and storm, yet comforting, a bond formed without words. She traced the rim of the lantern with her eyes, watching the way the flame flickered, and felt her pulse sync with its rhythm, the small, steadfast fire a mirror of something tentative growing between them. Elias leaned back slightly, watching her with quiet intensity, his hand resting near hers. willing her to notice but not forcing her into acknowledgement. The storm raged on beyond the walls, but inside, the ranch felt like an island, protected by the firelight and the closeness they shared. Clara shifted, brushing mud from her skirt, and Elias offered a dry blanket, draping it around her shoulders with careful hands. Their fingers met again, lingering this time, each aware of the other's heartbeat, each reluctant to break the contact. Outside, the wind howled, rattling boards and snapping branches, but they sat together, soaked and weary, yet tethered in a way that felt indestructible. Every crack of lightning, every roll of thunder seemed to cleanse the air, washing away the fear and hesitation that had clung to her, leaving only the warmth of proximity, the fragility of trust, and the first sparks of something like love. The lantern flickered once more, shadows stretching and shrinking as their hands brushed again, neither moving away, and for a fleeting moment, Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps storms could bring not only chaos but clarity, and that in this small, mud-slicked room, she might finally find a place to stay, a heart to trust, and a warmth that would not abandon her. The morning air was sharp and brittle, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and churned mud across the streets of Dusthaven. Clara had barely begun to trust the quiet of the ranch when the town stirred with an unsettling tension. A rider appeared at the far edge of the boardwalk, boots spurring his horse through puddles, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his eyes, his coat whipping in the wind. Elias saw him first, chest tightening as recognition struck. The man was tall, cruel in posture and expression, radiating a menace that made the wind seem colder, sharper. Clara's stomach lurched, fear coiling like a snake around her ribcage, and she instinctively drew back behind Elias as he stepped forward, placing a protective hand against her shoulder. "He's here for you," Elias murmured, voice low but steady, trying to anchor her trembling. The townsfolk had begun to gather at the saloon, their murmurs carrying across the square as the rider dismounted, spurs jangling like a warning bell. Clara's eyes darted between the shadows of the buildings and the man advancing, heart hammering as memories she had fought to bury clawed their way to the surface. Dark rooms, harsh voices, hands that left bruises both visible and invisible. Elias placed a firm hand on her elbow, guiding her forward, his jaw tight with determination. "You're not going anywhere," he said, voice carrying across the distance to where the abuser halted, squinting. The standoff was sudden and tense, the wind whipping the hems of coats and skirts, mud squishing beneath heavy boots, the world reduced to the taut space between them. The abuser demanded, voice cutting, "I said she comes with me now." His spurs jingled aggressively as he stomped the ground, eyes scanning the gathering crowd, daring anyone to defy him. Elias stood his ground, chest squared, voice calm but resonant. "She stays. You don't take her from this town. Not today, not ever." The townsfolk whispered among themselves, some moving closer, others pressing faces to windows, caught in the charged energy. Clara's fingers clenched the hem of her damp dress, nails biting into the fabric, yet her eyes flicked up toward Elias, finding strength in his unwavering stance. The abuser's nostrils flared, rage and disbelief mingling as he stepped forward, hand twitching toward a gun at his hip. Elias shifted slightly, an unspoken warning, grounding himself between Clara and the threat. And then Clara spoke. Her voice, once hesitant, trembling, whispered only to shadows and firelight, rose like the first notes of a bell cutting through the fog. "I will never go back," she said, clear, ringing, unafraid. The words stunned the onlookers, echoing against the saloon walls and across the rain-slicked boards. A hush fell, punctuated only by the rain dripping from awnings and the soft thud of boots on wet wood. The abuser's hand froze mid-motion, his expression twisting from fury to disbelief, the power of his control crumbling beneath her declaration. Clara's chest rose and fell rapidly, but the tremor in her voice carried more courage than she had ever known she possessed. Elias's hand brushed hers lightly, a silent acknowledgement of her bravery, his own tension easing just slightly as the truth of her resolve anchored him. The townsfolk shifted, murmurs turning into cautious approval, the realization that she had claimed her voice, her body, and her choices. The abuser's jaw tightened, eyes darting from her to Elias, and then back, understanding at last that neither she nor the town would bend to his cruelty. Clara lifted her chin, feeling the wind whip her hair against her cheeks, the rain masking the tears that had not yet fallen. and the strength she had summoned settled around her like armor. Elias' presence was steady, unwavering, a shield she had not realized she needed until this moment. The rider finally gave a frustrated snort, swinging back onto his horse, but Clara's gaze did not waver. Her whispered days were over. The silence that had caged her spirit was broken, and in its place rose the fierce clarity of self-possession and rebirth. Dusthaven seemed to exhale with her, the storm of fear giving way to the quiet satisfaction of courage acknowledged, and for the first time, Clara felt the taste of freedom mingle with the rain. Elias's hand stayed near hers, just a brush against her fingers, yet it carried the weight of protection and trust. The wind howled through the boardwalk, tugging at their clothes and hair, but inside that gale, a new strength had been forged, unyielding, luminous, and undeniable. The sun hung low over Dusthaven, bleeding gold and amber across the plains, painting the sky with streaks of fire and rose. Clara stood at the edge of the garden, her hands dirty from the rich soil, knees bent as she pressed seeds into the earth, each one a fragile promise. The rain from the storm had left the ground soft and forgiving, puddles reflecting the fading light like molten mirrors. Beside her, Elias worked in quiet concentration, hammering a fence post straight, brushing splinters from his palms. The ranch was slowly returning to life, the scars of neglect mending under their labor, just as they were beginning to mend themselves. Townsfolk, once skeptical and wary, had started to nod in acknowledgement as Clara passed, murmuring greetings that had once been absent. Yet she felt the remnants of fear in her chest, the memory of hands that had tried to control her, and she shook it off with a trembling exhale. Elias paused, wiping sweat and mud from his brow, and glanced at her, his eyes softening with the weight of shared history. "I still feel it sometimes," he murmured, voice low, almost to himself. "The loss. Every corner of this house reminds me." Clara's fingers froze mid-press, soil crumbling between them, and she swallowed, letting her own truths rise. "I've always wanted to live without fear," she admitted, voice barely audible. "To feel safe. To feel like I can stay." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as they worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of hammering and earth pressing together like a quiet conversation. The horses in the paddock shifted, the faint nicker of recognition carrying across the yard, and a gentle breeze tugged at the loose strands of Clara's hair, lifting them like a whispered benediction. They took turns carrying water to the garden, hands brushing over handles and edges, lingering just a moment too long, each touch unspoken, yet meaningful. The afternoon stretched, and sweat and mud were replaced by the warmth of sun on tired skin, the amber light softening shadows of the past. As the last of the seeds were tucked into the soil, Elias leaned against the fence, watching her, the lines of grief and worry etched deep but softened by the effort and shared labor. Clara's eyes lifted toward him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile fully, unguarded, as if the planting of the garden had also planted hope in her chest. The firewood stacked neatly, the fences repaired, and the house smelling faintly of bread and smoke. They stepped onto the porch together, exhausted and triumphant in silence. The horizon glowed, the sun setting in a blaze that seemed to touch the heart of the earth itself, casting long shadows behind them and bathing their figures in tender light. Clara sank onto the edge of the porch, legs dangling, fingers tracing the weathered boards, and exhaled, letting the weight of days and storms slip from her shoulders. Elias settled beside her, close enough for the heat of his presence to seep into her, yet respectful, patient, a quiet acknowledgement of shared triumph and fragility. The wind stirred, gentle now, carrying the scent of tilled soil and distant pine, a soft hymn of the land and the life they were creating. Clara whispered, voice fragile but steady, "Don't look at me." He reached out, cupping her chin gently, lifting her gaze until their eyes met. The golden light of the sunset reflected in his, warm and steadfast. "You're all I see," he replied, voice rich with certainty, love, and the weight of survival. A long silence followed, unbroken but full, as the air held their heartbeat, their shared breaths mingling with the faint rustle of leaves and the soft stir of the horses in the paddock. Shadows lengthened across the porch, and the first stars began to wink open in the deepening sky, small fires themselves against the dusk. Clara's hand brushed against his, lingering on the curve of his fingers, and she felt the unspoken promise of many tomorrows in that single touch. The land around them, scarred and raw from storms past, now held seeds sprouting toward life, just as they themselves had begun to grow together, fragile yet resilient. With the warmth of the sunset in their eyes and the scent of earth and fire, in the air they remained seated, hands entwined, hearts tethered, letting the quiet speak what words could not. And in that golden light, both understood that though the past had shaped them, it did not define them, and that love, patient and tender, could grow from ashes into embers bright enough to illuminate all the shadows that remained.